Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Kirkpatrick, and I'm a lead educator here at Wonders of Wildlife National Museum and Aquarium. I want to thank you today for joining us as we move into our first live stream for the month of May, where we're going to be talking about our theme, endangered species. If you're new here, then howdy. Along with the live streams we do every month, we also offer a really cool and free virtual scavenger hunt app that you can play along right at home. It comes with an activity guide, both with new missions and activities each month. To download the app and go explore all of this, go to www.wondersofwildlife.org/mission-conservation. This address will take you to our mission conservation webpage. On this page, check the box to the right that says Get the app and click the download button. There, you'll follow its instructions. Once you have that app downloaded, create a user account and log in. Next, hit the search bar and type in Mission Conservation. That's where all of our at-home missions will pop up right for you to play. If you look a little further down, you'll see our featured missions. Featured missions are the most current missions we have to offer, like the Endangered Species mission. The last place I'll bring your attention to on this page is the schedule of events and activities. This section will show you all the missions that are live, and if you click on the plus sign, it'll drop down a tab, and you can find the links to the activity guides for each at-home mission. The activity guides have an indoor craft as well as a fun outdoor activity. This is where you'll find many of our partners' missions descriptions. If you look right behind me, there's a very beautiful diorama showcasing an African elephant. Did you know that African elephants can eat up to 330 pounds of food per day? It'd be like eating 375 tins of baked beans every day. African elephants eat so much that up to 3/4 of their whole day can be spent eating. Elephants are part of a group of animals known as pachyderms, which means that they have rough, thick skin. Other pachyderms include the rhinoceros and the hippopotamus. Elephants, rhinos, and hippos are all marked as endangered or threatened species, which means that these species are very likely to become extinct in the very near future. But by following proper conservation laws and learning more about these species, we can keep them around for many generations to come. To learn more about endangered species and conservation success stories, we have Paige Weddick with us from the Missouri River Bird Observatory. She will be telling us all about the observatory and some of the bird populations that were endangered but made miraculous recoveries with their populations. Take it away, Paige.
Thanks, Justin. I'm really excited to talk to you all, not just about what endangered species are, but some of the bird conservation success stories today. I think you'll hopefully get inspired by some of the actions that we've taken to help these species. So if we want to throw up the slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself. So like Justin said, my name is Paige Weddick. And my title is the education coordinator for the Missouri River Bird Observatory. And I moved to Missouri in 2017. So I've been here for about 5 years now. I had grown up in Wisconsin, loving the outdoors, loving to be outside, but I didn't really get into birds until I went to college. I, thought they were cool. I was like, yay, they can fly. But I actually took a class in college called The Extinction of Species, which kind of ties into what we're going to talk today, but hopefully these species didn't go extinct, and hopefully other endangered ones don't. But the professor was an ornithologist, or somebody who studied birds. And so he would come into the class every day and go, birds are awesome. And then he would continue talking about whatever we were talking about that day in class. And I was kind of like, okay, yeah, great. Birds are cool, but like, I don't really get it. And then I took my ornithology class and was instantly fascinated by their anatomy and their physiology and their ecology and all things bird. And so I really developed a huge love for them. And I'm excited to share that with you today because I also think birds are awesome. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the organization that I work for and how we help birds and contribute to their conservation, you can visit our website, which is just mrbo.org. But today we're going to talk about 3 stories of recovery. So birds that were endangered and are no longer considered endangered. But first, what does that word endangered mean? What do we mean when we say a species is endangered? Does it mean that the species is in danger of being attacked by a predator? Does it mean that there are no remaining individuals of that species? Does it mean the species is considered to be facing a very high risk of extinction in the wild? Or does it mean that the species has a widespread and abundant population? So we're just going to take a few seconds and I want you to think about which one of those you think is the answer. All right, why don't we go to the next slide? So if you thought C, letter C, the species is considered to be facing a very high risk of extinction in the wild, you would be correct. So when we talk about when there are no remaining individuals of that species, that would be an extinct species. And if there's a widespread and abundant population, then they're not considered endangered either. So let me so where this these categories come from is the IUCN Red List. IUCN stands for International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species is the world's most comprehensive list of the global, like not just here in North America, but the global conservation status of plant and animal species. And it uses some criteria to evaluate the extinction risk of thousands of species. And these criteria are relevant to most species in most regions all over the world. So it has this strong scientific base and is recognized as one of the main guides to the status of our biological diversity all over the world. So these are kind of the different categories listed here on this slide. So not evaluated would mean that they haven't been evaluated against the criteria. Data deficient, or DD, is a species where there's inadequate information to make an accurate assessment of the risk of extinction. And this could be because even though the species is well studied and its biology is well known, they may just not have appropriate data on the abundance or distribution of that species, maybe because it's hard to track or something like that. So an example is the orca whale is considered a data deficient species. We can't get a good grasp on how they're doing. A species of least concern, or LC, is a species that they've looked at the criteria and it's not considered in any of those threatened categories you see above. So this would be a species like the Arctic fox. A species is near threatened, so NT, when it has been evaluated against those criteria, but doesn't qualify for some of those threatened categories, but it's close to qualifying for one of those categories, or it's likely to qualify for a threatened category in the near future. So an example of this species would be a plains bison. Now, a species is considered vulnerable when it faces a high risk of extinction in the wild. So an African elephant is an example of a vulnerable species. Now, finally, we're here at endangered. So a species is endangered, like I said, when they face a very high risk of extinction in the wild. So an example would be a tiger. A species is critically endangered when it's considered to be facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. And some of these critically endangered species we don't have a good grasp on how many individuals are actually left. So some of them may even be considered, really, really, really close to that extinction level. And then there's extinct in the wild, but sometimes species are still in captivity. And then there's extinct where there are no living individuals of that species. So the goal is to keep everybody below that vulnerable level, ideally below even least concerned. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the different categories or criteria that go into these different categories of species populations. They use population, how far is their geographic range, where can they live? Can they only survive in a small area because that's the only area that has the resources they need? Or is there a bigger scope for that species? Do they have a small population, and is it declining, or is it steady, or is it going up? and those types of things. So all of those kind of come together and put them in one of these three categories. So that's what we mean when we say endangered species, is that that species is at a very high risk of extinction in the wild. So, which is kind of sad to think about, that there are species that fall into those categories, right? But we're going to talk about 3 species that were considered endangered, but due to recovery efforts have been removed from that endangered species list. So even though they are considered endangered, we can change their status. We can help them recover on their population. So let's talk about some of these 3 stories. So you've probably heard of a bald eagle before. They're very popular here in the United States. And before we go into its conservation story, I wanted to share a little fun fact about the bald eagles. So hopefully this plays, but I want you to think true or false if this is the sound of a bald eagle. So if you, hopefully you heard that, and if for whatever reason the audio isn't working, I'm going to try to mimic it. So it's kind of like a high pitch, like cue. So true or false, is that the sound of a bald eagle? It's actually false. So that is the sound of a red-tailed hawk, as they kind of make it typically as they soar through the sky. So kind of it's much more majestic sounding. It's kind of almost terrifying when you hear it. When you're outside, that very high pitched like screech call. But a bald eagle actually sounds a little bit different. They sound like this. So this is my impression of a bald eagle call, in case that didn't go through, which is just like something like that, like this like little like screechy, like very kind of weak sounding sound. So a lot of us get mixed up because in movies, sometimes they'll play the red-shouldered hawk call when an eagle flies over, because it sounds a little bit more majestic than an eagle squeak. And that's kind of the effect they're going for as they show an eagle flying through the sky. But they, in fact, don't make noise very often. And when they do, they kind of make those weak calls. So the eagle, you're probably familiar with it because it's been a national bird and symbol for the United States of America since 1782. But it's actually been a spiritual symbol for Native peoples for far longer than that. But at one point, they were considered a critically endangered species, and they were threatened by a chemical called DDT, which you may or may not have heard before. And this chemical DDT became popular during World War I to combat this insect-borne illnesses like malaria. So malaria is transferred by mosquitoes. And what DDT does is it kills the mosquitoes. So it became widely used to try to protect people from these illnesses in homes and farms in the 1940s and the 1950s. But what they didn't know, as they were spraying it all over the place, not just to prevent the spread of disease, but also people tend to find mosquitoes a little bit annoying, and I understand that. But mainly for this one purpose is why it was started to be used. But what we didn't know quite at that time was how DDT had many, many detrimental effects for our health as humans, but also for wildlife, including birds. So when an eagle ingests DDT, it interferes with their ability to absorb calcium. And calcium is important for the strength of their eggshells to form properly. So what was happening is, because of all the DDT in the environment, the eagles absorbed more and more, and they were unable to absorb the calcium, so their eggshells were very weak. So when they would lay on their eggs to incubate them, which is necessary for the eggs to be able to develop, to be at a certain temperature, the eggs would crack. And so what happens when a population has trouble with breathing like that is their population declines quite rapidly, because if you're not able to create offspring, you're not able to create more eagles. So you get less and less of them. There's no eagles to replace the eagles as they get older. So eagles, who were already on decline from hunting and habitat loss, just dramatically decreased when we had these problems with DDT. And because they nest in near bodies of water and they eat fish, they were very susceptible to consuming this DDT, because the chemical would get in the water, and the insects and other things that fish eat would eat kind of, or could absorb the DDT. The fish consume those things, and then the eagle eats fish and multiple fish. So this process where it kind of, a chemical in the environment really affects kind of these animals more and more at each stage, that's called biomagnification. So that's what was happening to these eagles. And by 1963, there were only 417 nesting pairs remaining in North America. But in 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was published. And this book pointed out some of these detrimental effects that DDT was having, not only on eagles, but other birds and other creatures, as well as us humans. And in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, was formed and took action to ban this chemical DDT and several other pesticides. And in 1978, the bald eagle was listed for protection under the Endangered Species Act. So it was, we decided, they kind of evaluated its population and its chances, and they decided, yes, this eagle is at a very high risk of extinction. And so through the Endangered Species Act, they were able to enact different conservation actions. So we banned DDT, we made it illegal to hunt these eagles, we helped create more habitat for them, all kinds of things. And it took nearly 40 years for the bald eagle population to recover. But they're no longer considered a rare sighting. If you go to the right habitat, you're likely to see an eagle. And in June of 2007, the bird's recovery prompted removal from the endangered species list, because the population recovered enough for them to no longer be considered very high risk of extinction. And since 2009, the population has quadrupled and continues to steadily grow. And in 2019, not too long ago, they did a kind of census of the bald eagles, and there were over 71,400 nesting pairs. So that's way up from that 417. So when we put forth these conservation efforts, we can see this species recover, which is awesome that we did so for the bald eagle, because it's a pretty cool bird. Now, I'm just going to briefly go over, before we go over next story, I want to bring in another success story that's very similar to the story of the bald eagle. This is a peregrine falcon, and they were also affected by TDT. Peregrine falcons are considered, I think, like one of the fastest species in the world. When they dive down to catch prey, they go over 240 miles per hour. That is very, very fast, right? And they have all kinds of adaptations to be able to do that, which we're not going to go into as much today, but I highly encourage you to look into peregrine falcons more on your own. But in 1964, a survey found that peregrine falcons did not inhabit a single cliff in the eastern United States or in parts of Canada. But by 1970, a mere 10 to 20% of the historical falcon population remained. So this is very low due to this egg and nesting collection, some illegal hunting practices, and DDT use. But the Endangered Species Act protections for the falcon allowed their populations to recover. And so this really was important for them to get their habitat back in place, so their eggshells weren't thin, just like with the eagle. And as a result, populations are thriving today. And the species was delisted from the endangered species list in 1999. And today there are about 3,000 breeding pairs of peregrines in North America, and we can find them here in Missouri as well. Okay, Our next story, the least tern. So this is probably a bird you're not as familiar with. Terns are a lot like gulls, but they have a little bit of a different behavior. And the interior least tern is the one that we're going to be talking about today. And they're the smallest of North American terns. And they have this nickname, or a kind of folk name for terns is striker, both because they hunt by striking the water. So they kind of soar above and they see the fish underneath and they dive down into the water and are able to catch those fish by diving into the water, which I think is super impressive. But they're also called strikers because adult birds will be very aggressive to defend their nests, which is totally understandable. They want to defend their young, and they'll dive bomb anyone that approaches their nest too long. So that's also why they're called strikers. And they're often called little strikers because they're a very small tern. So about their story. So least terns in their interior population. So these are birds that don't live kind of along that Atlantic coastline. So these birds prefer nesting on open sandbars near wide river channels. So think sandbars along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And in winter, they migrate to coastal areas of Central and South America and the Caribbean islands. But in the summer, they breed along these sandbars and these wide river channels. And before the species was protected as endangered, which it was listed as endangered in 1985, the number of interior least terns before that time had plummeted below 2,000 birds, which is very, very low. And due to the reason their populations declined was because of changes in the river systems. So we put in dams, dikes, which kind of help channelize rivers, reservoirs and water diversions, which eliminated a lot of their historic nesting habitat. So they can't raise young successfully if there's no habitat to do so. So these natural wide channels that had these different sandbars in between were replaced by very narrow, very armored bank rivers with much faster flowing water. But the birds have proven resilient to these habitat changes, and they've benefited from improved river management to create suitable habitat. So if you hear about things like the Big Muddy National Fish and Wildlife Refuge is a great kind of example of something that we're doing to kind of provide these offshoots in different areas for birds to nest, but also for fish to spawn and all kinds of different things like that. And now the interior least tern population is estimated at roughly 18,000 individuals. And on January 12th, 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that the interior least tern had fully recovered and can be removed from the endangered species list. So not too long ago, this one was very recent, which is why I wanted to share it with you because I was really excited to hear about this. So that Endangered Species Act and those protections and that different change in river management really allowed their numbers to expand almost tenfold over the past 3 decades. And I have a quote here from a woman named Stephanie Kuros, who is a senior policy specialist at the Center for Biological Diversity that I think kind of sums it up really nicely. She says, "This small, scrappy bird has struggled to survive for so long, and thanks to the strong protections of the Endangered Species Act, it's been brought back from the brink of extinction. The tern's epic journey toward recovery shows what a powerful tool the act is for fighting the ongoing wildlife extinction crisis." And what I think is cool about the tern story, just like the eagle story and the one I'll share with you next, is that people were able to put in protections for these species and they recovered. Conservation works. So that's the story of the least tern. Next, I want to talk to you about a little bit of a smaller bird. This is called the Kirtland's warbler. You may not have heard of it before. Now is a great time to go out and look for warblers if you're interested in seeing them here in Missouri. However, you won't find the Kirtland's warbler. They can't be found here in Missouri, so that's their one downside. But they're this neat gray yellow bird, and they're one of the rarest songbirds in North America. They're a true habitat specialist, which I'll talk about a little bit more about that means in a second. They only raise young in young jack pine forests that are located in Michigan and adjacent parts of Wisconsin and Ontario in Canada. And on the next slide, I want to show you their what's called a range map. So this shows where the Kirtland's warbler lives or where you could theoretically find them. So the summer, where they spend the summer months or their breeding range, is in orange, an orangey color. And where they spend the winter is in blue. So you can see they spend the winter kind of in these islands off of Florida in the ocean. And then they breed in parts of Michigan and parts of Wisconsin and Ontario there. So, but their range is very, very smaller. If I were to show you like the cardinals range, it would show that they're all year round pretty much everywhere on this map, except for kind of those islands where they spend the winter. So a Kirtland's warbler is rather picky when it comes to habitat. It nests in areas of pine, but not just any pine. The Kirtland's warbler must have jack pines, and they must have an area, they must occupy an area over 80 acres in size. And the jack pines must be growing on well-drained soil, but not just any well-drained soil. They want what's called grayling sand, which allows the water to kind of percolate or kind of filter through so their nests don't get flooded. And that precise habitat is rather forbidding for us humans. So the low nutrient content of that grayling sand makes it inappropriate for us to grow things there for agriculture, and manicured lawns, they're not going to be able to grow there. So there have always been plenty of jack pines in the right area in that area, or in the right age in that area of Michigan, where forest fires occurred rather frequently due to the dry conditions. But jack pine cones don't open to release their seeds until they're exposed to the extreme heat of these fires. So they're among the very first plants to pop up after a forest fire. But unfortunately, us humans, we don't like fire as much. So we, for decades, our forest management included what's called like fire suppression. So we really tried to eliminate those fires. But this really limited the new growth of jack pines. And by 1975, the Kirtland's warbler population went way down because they don't have as much habitat. So there were fewer than 200 singing males that they documented. And because of this 200, Michigan kind of designated the Kirtland's warbler as the bicentennial bird because there are only 200 of them left, or that were discovered. So they nest, so they like certain jack pines and they have to be in that certain habitat, but they also like trees that are no younger than about 5 years old and no older than about 20 years old. And this is because the warblers nest on the ground beneath the pines, and the need for trees to be large enough for their bottom branches to provide protection. And they stop using the trees altogether when they've lost their lower branches, which can help once they're a certain age. So they need to be at least 5 years old to provide that enough protection. But if they're older than 20, then they don't have those lower branches to help protect their nests either because they grow taller. So the ideal habitat for them was historically found in this northern, or this large area of the northern part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. But like I said, jack pines don't open to release their seeds until they're exposed to that extreme heat of fires. So we need to have that fire to be able to release those seeds of those jack pines. So the Kirtland's warbler during that time was our rarest endangered songbird, except for a bird called the Bachman's warbler, which is now extinct. But thanks to the Endangered Species Act, foresters started managing Michigan's jack pine forest for Kirtland's warblers because we decided we wanted to help this bird recover, using fire as the primary tool to ensure that there were plenty of jack pines the right age. So these burned over areas provided so much appropriate habitat that the Kirtland's warbler population started growing. And in 1993, the census found 485 birds, which was more than double that low of 6 years later. And now the population includes over 2,000 pairs, so many that some had to move out to that beyond that range to the upper peninsula of Michigan and those areas of Ontario and Wisconsin. So what's really great is as long as we can ensure the continuation of this appropriate habitat for Kirtland's warblers, they should be able to continue to thrive thanks to these management strategies. So before we move on, I wanted to hopefully show a quick video of the Kirtland's warbler singing. It also has a little caterpillar in its mouth that is probably going to go feed to its young. So I think that's just a cute video. All right, so there that was the Kirtland's warbler singing. So if you go up to Michigan and those areas, you can maybe see one. So the point of all of these stories is to show that yes, some species can become endangered. They can be at a very high risk of extinction. But if we work towards their recovery and we give them the things they need to survive, they can make a recovery in their populations and they can come back. So what we do can make a difference. And we can help these birds and other critters that we highly value and are great to have around. And they provide, they make the ecosystem great. So before we go today, I just wanted to share one resource if you were interested in learning more about birds. I probably could say my favorite website is allaboutbirds.org, which is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And if you can go, and this is kind of what it looks like when you type that in, and you can search any species of birds and it'll tell you all about them, where you can find them, what they eat, where they live. You can learn about their population status as well. If you're interested in that, you can hear their songs, see pictures, learn how to ID them, all kinds of things. And so I highly recommend you do that if you're interested in birds, to visit that website and learn more. So that's all I have for you all today. Thank you for listening and hearing about these different bird conservation success stories. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. It's just my name, paige.whittick@mrbo.org. I'd love to answer your questions about birds or these different conservation stories. So I'm going to kick it back to Justin. Thank you all for inviting me here today. It was a lot of fun. Anytime I can talk about birds is a good day.
Thank you so much, Paige. As we end the live stream today, I want to thank everyone that tuned in to be with us here live, and also those that may be finding the video later on down the road. I want to, of course, give a special thank you to Paige and the entire team over at the Missouri River Bird Observatory for teaching us so much today, as well as every wild adventurer and conservation advocate out there helping our natural world. If you like today's program, please show us support by giving us that thumbs up on that YouTube page. And if you'd like to know what we have coming up in the future and want to stay in front of our live streams, just hit that subscribe button below. You'll also be able to find our awesome videos from the past lives, as well as have easier access for those yet to come. Our next live stream is going to be on May 15th with California's Bureau of Land Management. So make sure to set a reminder. As we sign off today, I, of course, want to challenge everyone to get outdoors, advocate for conservation, as well as be a voice for all of our wildlife friends. We're so lucky to have this wild world around us, and it's up to us and everyone to protect it. Hope you have a great day and never stop learning. Bye-bye.